Welcome back to the very basics of American politics, political institutions, a little bit of the history. We're now at the section on federalism because we've made it through that strange process of coming up with the Constitution and this bizarre compromise that exists between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that shuts out, of course, much of the actual population of the states. The Articles of Confederation, of course, had failed, and you come up with a Republican form of government where people are elected to represent folks. And in the context of all of the cultural heterogeneity across the country, it's just clear that things weren't going to work with the Articles of Confederation. And then in the Bill of Rights, the final section of the original Constitution, right, the 10th Amendment, gives powers to the states. And they say, listen, unless we specifically gave the power to the federal government, and unless the states were restricted from doing, you can't do it, then all the power stays with the states. But of course, there are lots of internal contradictions in our Constitution, as we're going to see. All right, federalism. Do you have any idea how many people hold elective office in the United States? Just try and get your head around it for a moment. We know, of course, you have 50 states. They're going to be the governors and the state legislatures. So that's going to be a lot. And at the federal level, you have 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate, a couple others who are elected here and there. Now the president, the vice president. But what's it actually turn out to be? And the best current estimate is well over 500,000 people. 500,000 people, yes, and mostly at the local level. These are individuals whose names appear on a ballot, who run for office, and if you think about an election cycle of 2 years, in a 2-year election cycle, just about 2 million Americans have their names on a ballot. So the cycling, the constant sense that there's an election for this, there's an election for that, it's very much present in our sense of the Republican form of government, right? Well, how many people are elected in what areas? This tremendous variability across the states. In North Dakota, there are 242 people, right, per 10,000, 242 elected officials per 10,000 people in each state. In Hawaii, not nearly as much. So tremendous variability across the state. Let's talk about federalism generally. Now, we know, of course, there's one federal government, and you probably know that there are 4 insular areas plus Puerto Rico. Not a state, but maybe someday will be. And then you move down to the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. The most recently published census of U.S. governments came out relatively recently, but it shows data from 2017. The link is here. You can also find all of these slides on the website. You feel free to download them, use them as you will. When we do look at the most recent data, you'll notice there are 561 federally recognized Indian tribes. Vary from state to state. Think about the jurisdictional boundaries. Does a tribal government end and a county government begin? Yeah, where? Who's responsible for education or for police powers? One of the remarkable things about the tribal nations is that they have tremendous variability among their constitutional types. So some have fairly centralized powers, others are highly decentralized. And you can imagine with that kind of variability, we can learn something about what works well and what doesn't work so well. Often when people talk about federalism in the United States, they say, oh, those laboratories of democracy. Oh, those state governments are laboratories of democracy, as if there are only 50 such laboratories. Well, there are 561 federally recognized tribal governments. And there are many, many more county governments. What do we mean by a county government? here again, you get tremendous variability. I'm from the great state of Wisconsin, so of course I want to show that to you. But if you click through and take a look at what different counties actually do, you see, again, huge variability. More of these places to try out different kinds of democracy, laboratories of democracy. What was a county government? A county government was left over from the early days of British rule. And when we think about a county government, you usually wanted to have about a day's ride away by horseback. And a lot of the things that happen at the county level would be like the sheriff and maybe some highways and roads. But across the states, there's huge variability. There are probably more than 3,031 if you include things like parishes and boroughs, and you can go ahead and click there and find that out. Also, this is a little map that comes to us from NACO, National Association of Counties. And if you want to learn about any one of these 3,000 plus counties, just take a look and see the tremendous variability. Think about Los Angeles County, for example. Massive population. And if you want power, you want to probably be one of those 5 queens of LA or kings of LA. Right now it's less, much more likely to be the powerful 5. If you're a county commissioner in Los Angeles County, you're more powerful than most members of the United States Congress. But here in Massachusetts, county governments are very weak. And in Rhode Island, they exist only in name only. Whereas a place like Virginia has very strong counties. So huge variability across the states in terms of what county governments can and can't do, how much they'll tax. But what's important is that in the initial creation of these counties, the government was relatively close to where the people were. Beyond county governments, of course, there are these independent school districts, most of which have independently elected school boards. But these independently elected school boards, can they decide things like curriculum? Well, yeah, most places they can. This is actually Houston, Texas, and around Houston you see the various sort of blotchy colors on the map. Those are the different school districts. Since a lot of the funding that goes into education in this country comes from local property taxes, if you happen to live in a relatively affluent area, you can probably afford much better schools and schooling. It's tremendously decentralized, these laboratories of democracy. Now, if you happen to be watching this and you come from another country, you look at this list, right? 1, 4, 50, 561, 3,000, 12,000. And you might think that there's a hierarchy here, but there is not a hierarchy. On many issues of the day, the federal government has hardly any say. With education, for example, how much money actually goes to K through 12 public education from the federal government? Well, out of every dollar that was spent on K through 12 education in 2018-2019, only 8 pennies came from the federal government. And of those 8 pennies, 5 of those pennies went to things like nutrition programs. So when it comes to actual programming in the schools, the federal government does not have tremendous power. And as a result, you can have school districts that discourage the teaching of evolution, biological evolution, and encourage the teaching of a more biblical form of creationism. You get huge variability in the quality of schooling and what's taught. Who's going to choose the textbooks? In much of the world, that's all very centrally controlled. China's gone through a recent reform, rewriting their own history and writing the new textbooks for everyone. But in the United States, it's a highly political process. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, who should be responsible for education in this country? You can run for president saying, I'm the education president, but the reality is the president has very little to say or can do about education policy. It's a very local concern. As a parent, I want to make sure that I have some say in how schools are run. But does it make sense that there are children who will graduate from high school and not understand some of the complexities around something like evolution? It's a trade-off. Who should be in charge? And across any policy, that's really ultimately an important question. Who should be in charge? And then next up, you've got municipalities and townships. And municipalities and townships are sort of differing by size. And a huge part of American government are in very small towns. We only have 10 municipalities with 1 million people or more. So with this kind of variability, with so many forms of government and so many people elected to office, it gets awfully complicated. But wait, there's more. Because within these jurisdictions that have elected officials, in some cases, those elected officials are pretty powerful. Like in Massachusetts, our mayor of Boston is elected independently of the city council, and she has a crazy amount of power. In Cambridge, this side of the river, the mayor of Cambridge is elected by a 9-person city council. And she doesn't have as much power. She's part of that legislative body. And in Cambridge, it's governed by a strong council manager system. An elected official who's a city manager. So you get all of this variability. Some mayors are strong, others are weak. Some legislatures are strong, others are weak. Some have these incredibly gifted bureaucrats. Pay attention to the ICMA.org website, for example. Huge amount of variability. But wait, there's more. Because we also have the fastest growing part of American government called special districts. Just outside of my office here, there's a bus stop for the MBTA, which is the regional bus and transportation. It's not owned by the city of Cambridge. It's not owned by the city of Boston. It's a regional transportation authority. It's a special district, and a special district has different ways, depending on the state, of being governed, of being financed. Look at all of these kinds of special districts by function. So there are 38,000 special districts in this country that cross all kinds of jurisdictional lines. You want to talk about crazy numbers of special districts? Colorado is going insane by creating special districts every time I turn around. And they have to do that because they can't raise taxes, so they're going to have fees for different services they put off in a new special district. Illinois, a ridiculous number of special districts. Everyone kind of funded in a slightly different way. Sometimes done transparently, other times, who knows. And yeah, there's a mosquito control district. Big deal. But a lot of these districts make sense about crossing jurisdictional bounds. There are almost 6,000 fire protection districts in this country. So, if you combine your fire services across your city lines, that makes a lot of sense. But how's it going to be paid? How much does one city pay as opposed to another city? There are over 1,000 special districts that deal with highways in this country. Talk about a complicated system. We'll talk in a little bit about one of these special districts, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and I include the link here for you. I really encourage you to go take a look at it. It's astonishing what a place like the Port Authority can do. But how do you govern something like the Port Authority? And whose voices are you going to listen to? If a representative form of government is us electing people into office, are these special districts comprised of people who are elected, or are they somehow appointed, and how are they accountable? And by the way, who's paying for all of this? Now, you'll remember in one of the earlier slides, I said, okay, if you add up how much money we spend on government, through taxes alone, it's only 27% of the gross domestic product, which just puts us down there with Jamaica. Not a big part of the U.S. economy. And yes, there are nonprofits that do a lot of the work. But still, oddly enough, I feel, David, standing here today, I feel like I'm kind of surrounded by government. And these governments are looking for money at almost every time you turn around. I'm reminded of in Gulliver's Travels, where the giant is being tied down by the Lilliputians. That's sometimes how it feels to live in the United States of America, a country that was founded by this driving suspicion and mistrust of government, especially centralized government and large government. And yet now look what we have. Every time I turn around, it feels like I'm being taxed. And so, okay, it simply is a fact that the United States, relative to all of our comparative nations, we are way under taxed compared to all of our relevant nation states. But it sure doesn't feel like that. We don't have a big value-added tax that's hidden. Instead, there's a property tax. There's an income tax. Oh, there's a sales tax. Oh, you wanted to go to a baseball game? Oh, there's another tax there. Oh, your kids are in school? There's an extra fee there. Oh, wait, a special district? Oh, yes. Every time you flush the toilet, there's another fee. And those count in the heritage statistics as a form of taxes, because fees for government services are taxes. Every time we turn around, it feels like this federalized system, this crazy decentralized system is taxing us. That's an interesting place for us to be, right? We are founded around this idea that you can't trust government, and yet we're surrounded by government. Now, imagine you're actually in government. How do you get anything done? If there's no real hierarchy, you can't order somebody to do something. How do you get something done in this incredible federal system? This is a really interesting picture, isn't it? This is actually the picture of Hurricane Katrina when it was out in the Gulf. And as I think back on those days of Hurricane Katrina, as I remember what it was like, it somehow feels like it sort of snuck up on us, because when everybody is in charge of something and nobody's in charge of it, our response to Hurricane Katrina was maybe a little bit underdone. I'll go back to this, because no one is in charge. There isn't a clear hierarchy. And when you're operating in that environment, when the threat over the horizon is just out there, in government service, you need to work with all of the layers of government and figure out how we can work together to get something done. So what is your personal view of the looming Hurricane Katrina that we can see on the satellite, and yet we are not prepared for? Of course, many people will think it's climate change. Others will think, well, it's something like a pandemic. We're living that one out. Maybe it's the looming federal debt. What are we going to do? But for whatever it is for you, your animating worry, your concern, you're going to need to be able to work into this system where no one is really in charge. How are you going to lead change in that kind of system? All right, the federal government. Total government employment functions. Here, this is local versus state. Education is done at the local level. Higher education, much more at the state level. Hospitals, so on and so forth. Many of the things that we think about government happen at the very local level. And where the jurisdictional boundaries are sort of not clear, you can get all kinds of crazy things happening. When I was in college in Wisconsin, one evening I was coming back from a job in Brown County, and I rear-ended a car at the intersection. And I didn't realize it at the time. It wasn't a serious accident, but I rear-ended the car in front of me. And this poor, kind woman who I rear-ended, her car, the front of her car was in Outagamie County, and my car was in Brown County. And of course, the sheriffs came, and it was a jurisdictional concern. Like, was this your accident? This is my accident. We just agreed that I would take care of it, and neither county had to write it up. It's an odd system with strange overlaps and often negotiated at a very close level. All right, this table will show us it does show us the full-time employment. This is FTEs, which is full-time equivalent employees. So this is somebody works half-time, another person works half-time. That adds up to one full-time person. And this is the total population at the federal level, and goes through the fourth quarter of 2018. So you're looking at about 1.8 million FTE employees in the federal government. Now let's take a look at this actually broken down. For the fourth quarter in FY 2017, the total is 1.86 million employees. And just take a look at where they are actually active. If you take sort of the remainder, it's 8.5% of the employees. But I want to look by agencies. The Department of Veterans Affairs alone has 18% of the total employment of the federal government. The Department of the Army is 12%. You keep adding it up. You get the Air Force, Homeland Security, Navy, Army, and the Veterans Affairs, and you're looking at 59% of the total employment in the U.S. federal government. What does the federal government do? Just look at where we spend our money. National security is an incredibly important part and large part of what the federal government does. You get up to 74% by including Department of Justice, Treasury, the Department of Defense. And by the way, these numbers do not include the uniform personnel who work in the U.S. military. Some of these departments are actually really kind of small. The Department of Labor, which is now run by the secretary, is a former mayor of Boston, has fewer than 15,000 full-time employees. But what about education? Look at education. Full-time employees for the Department of Education, 3,842 in the fourth quarter of 2017. That's smaller than an urban high school. And that includes everybody who works for the Department of Education. So, who's in charge? Depends on what the policy issue is. It's an incredibly complicated, convoluted system. Now, I need you to think about this in terms of what is called path dependency. Path dependency is where we are now depends on where we've been. You know, the path that got us here has a lot to say about where we're going to be going forward. Partly, you can think almost of path dependency as like the channels of a river. Right? Once that river is cut and more water goes down it, the channels of the river, the edges of the river get deeper and deeper and more in place. Well, we started off as a country with 2.5 million non-natives spread across the entire eastern seaboard. So it has to start at the local level. If we today could go out and somehow get in a time machine and go back 200 years and ask people, hey, so tell me, where is government? And when I say government, kind of what do you think about? What does government do? If you went back to the early 1800s, after we fought a Revolutionary War to become a state, become an entire country, after the Articles of Confederation were rewritten into the Constitution, and you ask people, where is government? They would say, well, government is, of course, in the county seat. And instead of having a T-shirt that would say USA, if that the equivalent of a T-shirt in the 1820s would have the name of your county on it. Well, they didn't have T-shirts, but conceptually you get it. Essex, right? Suffolk, Middlesex. That's your identity. Was with the county. Even in the 1800s, in the vernacular, what people were talking about was not the United States of America. We were the United States in America. Focus on the states. We're United States in America. And those states are made up of counties. County governments were important because you usually tried to have a county government that was within 1 day's ride away by horseback. In much of the country, that's where the actual voting would take place, in the county seat. It's where birth, death, property transactions are recorded. It's where the county court is. It's where the roads are. It's where the sheriff was. And it's where voting records were kept. So, very decentralized. And great pride in your county government. Okay. Fast forward to the early 1900s. By then, of course, we survived the Civil War, which was horrific. Over 700,000 young men died, changing the demographic composition of the country dramatically, opening up the necessity for opening up immigration to feed the Industrial Revolution. There'd been a march towards the cities. After we'd fought a civil war to maintain ourselves as a nation, and we asked people 100 years ago, so where do you think government? Well, tell me about government. They would say, well, of course, government is in the state capital because that's the place that makes most of the laws that I have to pay attention to. The states had income taxes. The federal government didn't have an income tax until a little more than 100 years ago. And even then, they wanted to keep it relatively low. But a state capital was supposed to be about a day's ride away by train. And it's where most of the laws that impacted people day in and day out were actually passed. And they took your money. And today, if you ask somebody where's government, they say government is in Washington, D.C., and I hate the government. I don't trust them. It's about a day's ride away by an airplane. They do a lot of the functions of government that have to be done at the national level. The defense, income transfers from the middle-aged to the old, or from the young to the old, or from this group to that group, this state to that state. They handle international agreements. Okay, I talked about path dependency. This is the takeaway on federalism with respect to these three broad categories: counties, states, and the federal government. Almost everything that was done at the county level 200 years ago is still done there today. Almost everything that was done at the state level 100 years ago is still done there today. When the election took place in 2000, Bush v. Gore, I was involved in some of the work legislatively that happened after that. And at the time of that election, we only had 2 states in the country that had centrally located, dynamically updatable voter files. Okay, that ends up becoming required in the Help America Vote Act. But at that time, only the state of Michigan and the state of Oklahoma had centrally located, dynamically updatable voter files. Why? Because everybody else was still doing it at the county level. So, it is a complicated system that grew up exactly the opposite of how Europe works. Government that was local, and government that was the state level, and now the federal government. Powers incredibly decentralized, highly fractured, and not hierarchical. Decidedly not hierarchical. Talk about American exceptionalism. How about the American miracle that we can get anything done? And the driving question is, okay, all right, this is interesting, but who should government be? I mean, where should government be? Like, should it be at the federal level or should it be at the state level? I want to tell you a story about this little plane. This little plane, of course, is the Concorde. Doesn't fly anymore, but there was an interesting bit of drama when it was originally supposed to fly into the United States. So the Concorde was built, it was very expensive. It was built by the French government and by the British government, largely those two, the French taking the lead. And it was built with the expectation that in order to make money, it was designed to fly across the Atlantic and land at New York. However, New York didn't want it to land in New York. You have the Transit Authority. I told you to take a look at their website earlier. And the Transit Authority said, you know what? We know a few things about this airplane. It's very fast, absolutely. It is very expensive, too bad, and it's very loud. In fact, it's so loud that our noise abatement board isn't going to allow it to land here. So this small group said, no, you can't land here. And you see the drama play out, play out all over the place. The governor says, it has to be denied, right? It has to be denied. You can't have it here. Now, you have a brand new president. Jimmy Carter is elected in the fall of 1976, inaugurated, and is in office in early 1977, when the president of France gives him a telephone call. He says, this is really important. This amazing airplane it's the pride of French engineering. It's a marvelous plane. President Carter, by the way, an engineer, a naval engineer, served on submarines in World War II. President Carter said, oh my goodness, great engineering, great plane. And the president of France says, we need to be able to land in New York. And President Carter said, you have my full support. However, the Port Authority continued to say no. The president of France continues to be upset. And after it's denied one more time, it calls the president of the United States again. It says, listen, we really need to be able to land. President Carter says, you have my full support, but there's nothing I can do. And at that point, things ultimately got taken out of normal process, and they had to find workarounds. But there isn't anything that the president could do. Why would the president of France imagine that President Carter could order something to be done? Because in France, the president has more power. But presidential power in this country is necessarily limited. Finally, when the Supreme Court got involved and they understood the economic consequences of saying no to the SST, and some concessions were made, the plane was allowed to land over the loud objections of the neighbors around the airport. Federalism. You know, if the president of France understood American politics as well as you do by now, he would have gone straight to that Port Authority and talked to the Noise Abatement Board before he called President Carter. But really, who should the government be listening to? Where does government work best, whether it's education policy, national level, state level, county level, local level? Economic policy, you have one state fighting against another for competition across different kinds of businesses. Where should government be? Well, we have to address another question first and think about it hard. Whose interests are actually represented? What does representation mean in American politics? Let's turn to that next. How did we think about federalism? It's a mess. Whose interests are represented? We'll get there in a moment.